Hey, Michael.
Good morning, Howard. This is Michael joining.
Hey. Well, I don't think the recording kicked off last meeting, so there was still some glitch, I think.
Okay, I haven't honestly had a chance this week to go back and check. I'll go validate that right now.
Yeah. Scheduling policy. This morning I just approved Brian Grant joining the working group. It just feels so unreal.
Approved what? I'm sorry?
Brian Grant, the Google's Kubernetes chief architect.
Mm-hmm.
Just approved him join our working group, the Google group.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. Okay, let's wait for another like 3 minutes or 5 minutes for more people to join.
Yeah, that's fine. I was just double checking and I do not see a recording for March 22nd, so it doesn't look like there was a problem with your recording. So apologies for that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So Torren, Isa is here, Khalid is here, Torren is not here. Okay, let's get started. So as usual, please write down your name on the meeting note. So some just quick update on the KubeCon preparation. Last week, we talked about Michael's idea about our sessions planning, since we got two sessions. So the initial idea is for the intro section, we slide it into two sections. So we have the work group intro and also invite the safe working group folks come over and do a little bit the safe intro. For the deep dive, my current thinking is we could invite teams that actually doing the development work on features that related to policy. I just listed some of the candidates team that we could consider send out invitation probably early April to see everyone's availability. OPA, Kube Arbitrator, that was brought up by Khalid. SIGAUTH, so the pod restriction proposal team, explained last week. That was from SIGAUTH, also SIG Architect, and also multi-tenancy. I think Eric brought that up. So any other team that we should consider like candidate that we should reach out to.
I don't know that I have any additional to add. I think that sounds like it makes sense.
Be good to see a list of all of the SIGs.
The best cheat sheet I see for that is actually the community Git repo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So how about maybe the Istio team or the Spiffy? Well, OPA and Spiffy was approved like earlier. Any interest? Yes. Okay, let's just leave it to that. I think should be okay for the moment. The PR article, I have to apologize. I haven't got the time to working on it, but we'll do, I think, the end of this week and also next week to catch before the 10th deadline. Okay, so next up, the SIG architecture discussion. Offline again.
And I realized too late that I had a conflict this morning and wasn't able to join, so it was just Erica representing us. So okay. I heard things went well. But,
I mean, I don't think
the ball on that one.
There was too much discussion. So, but in agreement that there's a lot to discuss, and therefore we should have a place to discuss that. Hey, we already have this working group called policy. So I think the major thing that came out was, hey, let's talk about some of this, all of these policy areas in the working group. So nothing too definitive. Some look at the pod restriction PR and the scheduling policy one. I think there was some concern that these stay rooted in real, or not just real, but concrete examples or use cases, which I think we are doing.
So who proposed the scheduling policy? Can you give a brief introduction on this item?
I do not have any more information at the moment than you do.
Okay.
I believe it's that scheduling is really a policy kind of area where deciding where to place things depends on a wide range of kind of different concepts within Kubernetes right now. And to kind of have a unified way to do this. I can get more if people have specific questions about that, because now I know the people who are doing it. And I know they will be interested in kind of helping to move that case into the picture that we have started to design. So in particular, what was I going to work with Yassine to kind of put the scheduling policy in terms of the policy as we have been describing it. We were thinking of helping to do a more formal KEP as we were doing this. That's the kind of, I guess, proposed way to make proposals, sort of. So it'd be mostly, I think, taking a lot from, or most of what we have in the doc for the proposal and putting it into this just more formal format.
So the input they're asking from our working group is regarding the use case?
That, I think, was SIG architecture's main concern.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe I'm.
So I think the net is. I think the key thing, right, and it was probably coming from Clayton, maybe highlighting the relationship of policy to scheduling.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I do know that they are thinking about that, but I guess.
But I think it's okay. I think, Eric, what I'm parsing out though is that scheduling has a lot of policy, behavior, definition, et cetera, already part of it now. If there is a policy working group looking at that, I guess maybe partly as a kind of a review function, but maybe also looking at where there's gaps or other intersections. Because it's a rich area where there's already a lot of policy language, a lot of policy behavior that's built into the platform.
Yeah, I think they were looking at introducing a new policy, and then when kind of to work into what we have for the working group, does that fit these sort of abstractions and conceptions that we've been thinking about as well, and make sure those pictures fit together.
Okay.
Yeah, so was there any ETA for this spec to land? Or even
everyone is looking to aim for KubeCon, so.
Huh?
KubeCon is everyone's, I think, goal, or 111. So very quickly.
Oh, I think this is what they call conference-driven development.
I thought maybe they're shooting for Q4 or something. 111. That'll be June.
Jeez. For proof of concept, I think. I cannot imagine that that'd be a lot of work to get into one thing.
Yeah, so would it be possible to invite the author here to so Yassine is based in Europe, I guess.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe we
Yes.
need like a TikTok meeting for the more European friendly meeting that the two authors could come over and introduce this. I'm still confused what the current RBAC can now do. Like why they're needing like RBAC on the scheduler?
Sorry, what's the question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm a little bit confused, like for the motivation of the spec. It seems to me the proposal wants to like define a role access for the scheduler, right? So what's the current RBAC mechanism can do on this perspective?
So RBAC only operates at the resource level. So RBAC says you can create a pod or not, but it doesn't have any say over what settings on that pod you can set. And so the scheduler operates on the tolerations and the node selector and a bunch of other fields within that. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, okay. So that means like we, okay, I think this could falls into the our capacity leasing use case, right? If we gonna like divide it up like line of business that each of them has like different scheduling policies or capabilities, they can set it through the new scheduling policy object.
Possibly.
Right? So,
there might need to be some extensions to what they're calling the scheduling policy to have that dynamic usage kind of data. But I don't know.
So now by default it's just the admin have the right to do the scheduling or the things, right? So the implication of this proposal will be we could differentiate, we could give out like different scheduling policy, maybe even to like user, but with the hierarchical, like the domain privilege for certain role. Am I understanding this correctly?
I think the idea is that right now it's not just the admin who has control over the scheduling. Any user that can create a workload on the cluster can control where that workload runs. And so this is actually moving some of that control to the admin so that the admin can say, you are only allowed to control scheduling in this way that I specify through this policy.
Yeah. Cool. I think this.
Yeah, I think that's why it brings up one of the more contentious points is about like defaults, in the sense of if you are kind of saying that you're restricting how you're allowed to, how you can decide where you can be scheduled as a pod, that sort of can change existing behavior in a way that's not just like adding something on in addition, but kind of creating a default, more restrictive, not necessarily transparent to the user concepts.
Yeah.
What is the business use case for this kind of affinity? Like, why would a customer request something like this? As in, like, I want my pod to run in a certain, I don't know, like, there are some criterias out there. Like, what is the business need here?
Yeah, I think it's the capacity leasing or the multi-tenancy use case we have been discussing. It's like, for example, you have a overall cloud and you want to like delegate some of the responsibilities to different line of business, right? You might need to set up a scheduling policy that, for example, the user in domain A or in effect, that would be the admin for domain A could just, for example, schedule a pod on certain nodes. I don't know if.
I think the self-hosting also has brought some of this to attention, which is like you want to, if the API itself and such are running as pods, you want those restricted to like specific nodes, and you don't want any old node to say, yeah, well, I want on there too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it sounds like this is constraining what users can do by sort of creating predefined profiles of what types of scheduling behavior they have access to based on their, organizational structure, right? So you might do, fair share between business units, but within a business unit, you might have, other types of policies governing how work capacity is allocated and then how workload is placed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
Yeah, at a higher level, there's kind of two reasons to care about where workloads are able to get scheduled, at least from a security perspective. One concern is that just container isolation isn't perfectly secure, and the boundary between nodes in the cluster is a harder security boundary. And so by saying, I don't want any of my workloads to be able to be scheduled on the master, that's one way of kind of locking down the master components more. And then sort of related to that is the noisy neighbor problem, where even if you can't escape the container, there's still, we don't have perfect resource isolation, and some workloads, use more disk IOPS than others, and I want to constrain how those workloads can be placed on the cluster.
I see.
So that's also why this is scoped on the cluster level, right? I
believe this is scoped. Yeah. I think you're right. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think there is some, at least, thought about how namespaces would play in terms of like maybe namespaces have different sort of policies themselves. I don't know that there's much talk about it means, or I think namespace admins, but.
I just wanted to mention the kind of 3 high-level takeaways that I took from the architecture meeting. One is general agreement that for kind of first-class Kubernetes policies, as opposed to things offered through extension points, but like the stuff that's built into Kubernetes, we need better guidelines around how those policies are designed, so that, the way that policies compose, the way that they're bound to workloads and objects, whether they're cluster or namespace scoped, all these things are consistent. If they have defaulting mechanisms, how that default works, how that composes with other policies. Kind of answers to all these questions, which is sort of what I was trying to do with pod restriction proposal, but thinking kind of more broadly than that, rather than trying to put everything in one policy. We can keep separate policies, but they should be consistent between them.
Yeah.
The other piece is what policies actually should be built into Kubernetes as opposed to deferring to third-party mechanisms. And then the last piece is kind of like where Open Policy Agent fits into this picture, which is really closely related to the other question of what things should we defer to Open Policy Agent and what things do we need a scheduling policy and a pod security policy and those kinds of resources for. And then also bringing it back to the use cases and kind of motivating all of these decisions by concrete use cases.
Okay, great. So, what should be the action items for us to take on these two proposals?
I think starting with the last two questions would probably be the most helpful at this point to decide which policies should we be pursuing at this time, and better understanding how different third-party policy mechanisms fit into the picture.
Okay, so yeah, but I think another problem related to this is like how should we set up the timeline to provide some outcome of the discussion on this issue. So apparently we cannot like discuss this forever in the policy working group. So what would be what is your feeling that the SIG arc and also SIG auth like is looking forward to some at least initial outcome from the policy working group to offer something, some kind of initial conclusion on the recommendation of, you know, what the policy architecture might look like.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't think that we're going to answer all these questions before we need to unblock the scheduling policy. Okay. And, you know, we already have a number of policies. Some of them are already in beta. I don't know what's in GA at the moment, but so I think a certain amount of this is going to have to be like going back and revising policies, you know, maybe even pushing towards V2 kind of features. But this is kind of thinking long-term, like what is the desired end state for policy in Kubernetes?
Have we discussed whether, maybe this is kind of too crazy, but whether policy makes sense at all in Kubernetes, or is it really a crutch to make up for the lack of something else?
Yeah, I think that that it's a very much a valid question, and it comes back to you know, how the third-party mechanisms fit in. One thing that someone offered in the last meeting was to take some of the pod security policy examples and rewrite them in OPA's policy language and kind of spec out what those look like. I think that would be a good starting point. But then there's some policy which requires kind of a deeper semantic understanding of the objects. And I think that's where it really makes sense to keep that within Kubernetes.
Okay, then fair to say we could start with these two proposals, right? As like concrete.
Yeah, I wouldn't dwell on pod restriction too much. I'm probably going to sort of disband that and try and turn that into succeed that with a proposal to start thinking about what that consistent policy design in Kubernetes would look like.
Okay. I think the pod restriction proposal, though, one thing I think it kind of brought to light that hasn't been focused as much about are what the base sort of objects are that we can talk about and actually assign policies to. Mm-hmm. It might seem obvious, but I don't know that we've actually fully really talked about it as much, except for the pod.
Yeah, I haven't really heard any use cases for non-pod policy. There's sort of node policy stuff, but that's really just about cluster setup kind of. but I'd be interested in hearing use cases for policy restrictions on other resources.
So one of the things that Eric and I had discussed as part of the GDPR use case was to maybe propose a data control policy where we would use labels or annotations, resources like pods, but also resources like persistent volumes and persistent volume claims. Maybe things like network, well, but at least those. So places where we wanted to allow an object to flag whether it was providing or managing some kind of compliance-related data, sensitive personal information, personally identifiable information, system identifiable information, ... And then define a policy around whether that kind of information was allowed within a namespace or not. And so under that type of policy language or policy use case, I think you could see more than just pod being affected, because it's also the data that the pod attaches to.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I still see the pod sort of as the center. What we care about is what code gets run. And then in parts of that include with touching and accessing what data, talking to who, where it's run, how many resources it can take, all those kind of things. The only thing besides pods I can think of are the policies themselves, and being able to, so meta policy almost, things, if you can change who can access what, that's almost something else. I don't know, maybe it's not, because maybe you only care about that if you can run a pod. I don't know.
Yeah, that's kind of like cluster policy. If you're running a bunch of different clusters, to be able to keep the policies consistent across them, I think. And there is I don't know if it's a SIG or a working group or what exactly, but there's folks working on the multi-cluster kind of scenarios.
I also heard some discussion about the RBAC. The RBAC can be turned into generic policies for access control.
I mean, the important part about the RBAC as it's designed is it's really binding the roles to objects. And so long as you define the objects right, it kind of works for all of your use cases. Do you see areas where?
Yeah, so I think Tim's policy restriction proposal already mentioned the binding with RBAC may not be a good idea. And there's another problem with current RBAC. The current RBAC only define the allow rules for the users. There's no deny rules. So it will sometimes make the RBAC definition really complicated if we want to deny a very particular access. So in some situation, if there's kind of like a policy definition, maybe OPA or something, which is powerful enough to define for a particular complicated example that I can introduce the how to say that, the deny scenario, that would be helpful.
Okay, if we were to break down to like specific items that we could action upon for the policy definition, what Tim mentioned is the SIG-ARC and also SIG-AUTH is looking at like a let's say standard way to define the policy object. But also we should like allow like from the pod restriction proposal, and remember we want to allow like different policy on different level.
Do you mean the composition of policy, or are you thinking something else?
Yeah, I think it's something else. Tim, are you still here?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're referring to. Maybe the priority, is that maybe?
Yeah, I mean, in your pod restriction proposal, I remember you mentioned that we also want to like preserve the flexibility of like policy definition on different level, or I can't remember exactly what the...
I'm not sure what you mean by different levels.
So we want to have a unified policies for... Okay, so anyways, so this like a good actionable like items for us to take, like a standard way to define the policy object across the Kubernetes, the first class Kubernetes architecture.
Yeah, and I would break that down further into how policy objects compose, how they get mapped to the resources that they're restricting, how defaults fit in, or other mutations.
I think there was a mention of conflict resolution.
Yeah, I see that kind of as a subclass of composition. But,
yeah, I was thinking that I think the only time that conflict might need to be something called out is just in race distributed systems, different in the time differences between how things when they're defined and what state things are in.
I think most of that is handled by the API server machinery.
Mostly, I think.
Okay, so what about the non-pod policy we just discussed, like node policy, cluster policy? That should be also part of the work.
I see that as being part of the answer to the question of what policies should be in like kind of Kubernetes core, and what policies should be delegated to a third party.
Okay, so that's the architecture question.
Yeah.
Okay. Fill in, this is like OPA, maybe spiffy. Well, not spiffy exactly, but so for the format of these two action items, shall we looking at maybe like collaborating on the proposals to the like specs, or so for example, if they're shooting the scheduling policy for like 1.11, I don't think any documentation work we have been doing here will catch up with that pace, right?
We'll at least try a little bit. I'll be meeting with Yassine on Monday and seeing if we can kind of make a bit of, put some of this together into a cap.
Okay. So
yeah,
so
for the immediate
maybe
action items with regard to unblocking the scheduling policy, I think that the two questions there are, do we want a scheduling policy at all? Like, is this something that we see as being valuable as a first-party policy resource, or is this something that could be handled by OPA or another plugin? Then the second question is, if yes, then start thinking about the more general policy definition and try and apply some of the, the direction that we would like to see that go in to the scheduling policy, so that when we come out with a final spec there, less changes are necessary.
Yeah, okay, got it. So Erica, maybe like set up a meeting next Monday with Yasin.
Yes.
You're on the East Coast, right?
Yep.
Okay, that could be doable for me. So Monday. Okay. Cool.
And did you say the time for that discussion on Monday?
We were meeting at noon or 4 p.m. UTC.
Okay.
4 p.m. UTC. Okay, that's that's doable.
What time is that for you?
It's 12. But yeah, I usually up until 1. So it's like 12 in the morning. Yeah.
Well.
Oh, sure. So maybe you can send like a meeting invite to the Google group.
Okay.
Erica.
Sure.
Cool. Okay, this is absolutely. Okay, we have roughly 15 minutes left. So Michael, do you have any update on the compliance scenario?
So yes, so Eric and I had a chance to go through, and if you scroll down to the bottom, there's a couple of good updates here.
Here, right?
A little bit higher, a little bit higher. And there we go. So we had previously, I guess going back nearly 3 or 4 meetings now, had gone through and looked at some use cases with the data controller and the compliance officer, basically, as personas that are defined specifically by GDPR. We wanted to look at how could those roles both define policy that governed what kind of data could be placed where and where it was in use, as well as when violations occur. Right? That's a key use case that we have to support. So basically, is there some visibility to when data, how should data be managed on the platform, and when has data been mismanaged? When has the data on the platform been mismanaged in some way? So as we were kind of talking through it, it wasn't clear that we could map the needs onto existing policy constructs in the platform. So we kind of talked about auditing as one major concern, particularly access to certain kinds of data, certain resources in the platform. But there wasn't really a way to kind of peer into a persistent volume or peer into a pod and understand, does this persistent volume store data that is relevant to GDPR compliance or any other data standard compliance? So then we ultimately said, well, what if we actually suggest a new policy? And we started at least sketching it out for discussion here, hence this data control policy. So the idea being that we could introduce a specific policy that was focused on management of data and layer it on top of existing annotations and labels for objects in the system. The idea being that the data control policy could say, what are some of the things that you could do, sort of like an RBAC, but then we're focusing on the data class. What kind of data does this policy apply to? What's the scope? So here, scope, we consider things like label selectors. I label a collection of objects, or I select a subset of namespaces. Then details around audits, and so we hand-wave a little bit around, could I define the policy to basically capture, here are the requirements, the audit requirements for the data. If the audit policy for the cluster was changed in such a way as to be incompatible, then I want to flag that, right? That's a violation. If I go in and modify the audit policy and remove audit log behavior over when persistent volumes are created, as an example, that may be something that we'd actually want to flag as an issue. If I attempt to mount a persistent volume with an annotation or a label that indicates it has sensitive personal information or personally identifiable information into a namespace whose data policy does not allow it, that again is a violation. I want to flag that as an issue as well. So the idea being that I could define a data control policy, say for my dev namespaces, and say these dev namespaces are not allowed to have sensitive personal information, personally identifiable information, etc. I could create a separate data control policy for my production namespaces and say these are allowed to have all of these types of data that are governed by GDPR. I might, it's not listed here, but we could extend this a little bit as well. Certain nodes within the cluster may allow or disallow. Again, that kind of scope could be extended very easily to think of nodes which have certain labels are allowed to have sensitive information and others are not. But basically the idea was to actually create a policy that allowed the data control officer, the data control personality, to actually say, this is how I want data managed on the platform, to describe the intent and the behavior, and then use annotations and labels across virtually any other object in the platform that was relevant. And this goes back to the comment from earlier. Pods, obviously, if a pod interacts with personal information, we want to know about that, persistent volumes, etc. So I'll take a step back. Does this resonate? Does it seem like it's useful? Is it something that we should continue trying to press forward
on? So what does the SPI and PII mean?
So sensitive personal information is a common acronym for, at least in the US or North America. PII is also a common acronym for personally identifiable information.
Okay.
And we anticipate that there exists a data standard, data classification standard that we could simply reference with standard classifications of sensitive data. Because PII, SPI, PCI, et cetera, right, there's already a set of labels that sort of define, hey, this kind of information looks like this. The data class might also declare arbitrary labels that are important to the user, right, whether the data is sensitive or not. In a government application, that might indicate whether a namespace allows classified information to be loaded or manipulated. So the data class itself, we wanted to keep somewhat generic, but probably reference an existing data classification standard with certain kinds of data classes that are already declared, that are already just kind of well known. And these are just some that we could point to pretty quickly that are referenced pretty widely.
I have a question regarding the enforcement. So what I understand right now is it's kind of define a bunch of rules we can check on the cluster to decide whether some violation happens. Is it possible we can prevent the violation from happening by enforce these rules?
In some cases, I think I can't remember if we actually ended up typing this out, but we discussed the interaction of admission controllers with this kind of policy. Do you have a data control policy admission controller, which says a pod labeled as containing personally identifiable information may not be, or an image which is labeled as having personally identifiable information, or a pod spec that's labeled as manipulating personally identifiable information may not be deployed in namespaces which don't have a compatible data control policy. So you could create an admission controller in that construct to prevent the pod from being deployed into dev if it's labeled as such. Persistent volumes, I'm not aware, and this is just a gap in my depth of knowledge on the low-level Kubernetes implementation, whether there is a similar kind of admission control or binding control for things like persistent volume claims. Can a persistent volume claim that says it's going to interact with personally identifiable information be created inside of a namespace which is not flagged as allowing that? And that's just a question I don't know the answer to today. I would expect that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so admission control operates on any resource in the cluster. So it's definitely technically feasible.
Okay.
I'm having a little bit of a hard time mapping, and this might just be my kind of lack of knowledge in the storage lifecycle space, but I'm having a little bit of trouble mapping the, I understand the goals of what you're saying, but having some trouble mapping that into Kubernetes concepts. And so I think what would be helpful for me to understand this is if you could say, like, here's an example of kind of what the workload and volume setup is, and we want to have a policy that says, you know, this volume cannot be used in this way and can be used in this way, and kind of a little more like drawn out of how that works.
So just to paraphrase, you're indicating laying out a specific flow or use case of, I create a persistent volume, I label it in such a way, I deploy a pod with a PVC that gets bound to it, and then describing how the policy would interact? Are you sort of asking to add the next layer of detail there, or are you asking a question about whether or not you find that useful at all?
Yeah, no, a little more about like what the workflow is, kind of the first thing would be helpful for me.
And we can go back and refine that. This at least gave us enough that we can kind of write down some of the raw thoughts and then use this as a forum to get feedback. I'm completely on board that it needs more detail. An open question for me then is for the group is then, if this is useful, do we start actually capturing it in a PR as opposed to a Google Doc? Or do we simply integrate it back into the broader use case document for the policy work group, discuss it at KubeCon as part of our deep dive session perhaps, and then after that submit it as a PR or have it ready at that point in time?
Have you discussed this with the storage SIG yet?
Not yet. No. Not yet.
I would definitely recommend getting their thoughts on it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Cool.
Actually, there's a quite similar use case from multi-tenancy perspective to prevent a persistent volume from being mounted to another pod within different namespace or different tenant.
Yeah, I was thinking I can imagine also like certain classified data can only be processed in areas without any like network access. I could see things like that. Geo restrictions as well on a lot of data.
Yeah, I was thinking about the geo restrictions. I'm not sure how much that makes sense in this context, since I I don't know how many.
Really, at this level, it would just be the granularity of the node labels, right?
Yeah.
We'd basically be declaring these nodes allow you to manage personally identifiable information or not. And really, that would be a label on the node, and then the data control policy. How would the data control policy interact then? Really, this might actually get interesting, kind of going back to the scheduler. Is there an interaction between a data control policy and the scheduler for whether or not a pod can be placed in a node? If the pod indicates that it manipulates personally identifiable information, is it allowed to be placed on a particular node in the cluster?
Yeah. So another question is how does it like deal with data produced for like logging, tracing?
Well, that was one of the things, the audit conditions, and I think we need more detail here. And I don't know what the right SIG would be to kind of get into auditing. I hadn't looked to see if there's an audit SIG or if that's just covered under one of the other SIGs. SIG auth? Okay, perfect. So the idea though is that we could go in and declare a set of audit policy, just follow the audit policy layout. Here's what we think would typically need to be audited. And that would give you sort of a reference, a suggestion of what we think you would need to audit in order to be GDPR compliant. But that doesn't help you with flagging violations, which is one of our use cases. So the idea with the data control policy, go ahead.
We should clarify that in GDPR, there's a strict separation between the people who define the policy, the people who put the enforcement mechanisms in place, and the people who look for violations or are able to like report if something went wrong. Those are all very like kind of separate different things. That might explain sort of why the auditing comes up so much. Is that that's not the same as the one making the decision.
It's sort of, exactly, it's checks and balances, right? And so what we had kind of landed on as at least final straw man, I don't know if I can use that as actual phrase, but the idea that the data control policy would declare sort of the meta needs of what had to be audited in a very simple format, something that was hard to mess up, and then would be comparing on an ongoing basis the audit policy that was set in the cluster to confirm whether it was following the guideline or not.
So this piece is a little bit of a harder sell for me. I definitely see the value in a client-side tool for kind of validating the audit policy and kind of meta policy in general. I'm having a hard time thinking about what this would actually look like in within Kubernetes as you've described it. Part of the problem, I think, right, is that the audit policy isn't defined in the Kubernetes API. It's just defined as a file on disk. But that's probably something that will change sooner rather than later.
Yeah, this one is
still should be.
Oh no, yeah,
agreed on the difficulty.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Erica.
Oh yeah, I think we've auditing has been, and logging has kind of been hand wavy for a lot of Kubernetes, and so it definitely is hard to think about what this would actually mean. And I know even like in multi-tenancy, making like segregating the logs from different tenants, and this gets quite complicated. And I definitely don't have answers here.
This feels a little like kind of a cluster config policy, and gets into sort of that discussion we were having earlier, component config. As more of the cluster config is moving into component config resources, that becomes something that you can kind of audit or enforce a little more strongly.
From an implementation perspective, that may very well make sense. I think if we step back for just a moment on the goals, the goal was to try to provide these new roles that are interacting with GDPR with a set of mechanics to do their job. And from that perspective, the implementation may take a different path, and that's where we're definitely looking for the guidance and the feedback on what is the best path. But I think the intent, at least, is to give them a way to talk about which parts of the system have sensitive information or are authorized for sensitive information, and what are sort of the meta behaviors like auditing, et cetera, that must be enforced in order for the GDPR standard to be properly followed.
Yeah, makes sense.
So I think let me see if I can paraphrase some of the feedback. I think you indicated it was maybe a weaker sell, and I think what you're really highlighting is that creating a new data control policy there may not be the best implementation approach. Or are you also indicating that you feel that the use case may not be as appropriate for either the policy work group or for Kube in general?
No, I understand the need for the use case, I understand the use case and the need for a solution to it. I'm not sure that a Kubernetes policy resource applied through admission is the right implementation of that. Does that make sense? Okay.
So would that be an alternative policy resource or an alternative implementation mechanism other than admission controller?
I was thinking more along the lines of an alternative implementation mechanism.
Okay.
Possibly something client side. As in a tool that I could run and point to a cluster and have it fetch the audit policy and compare it with some desired state and report a diff or something along those lines.
Gotcha. So ultimately, though, under that model, a cluster couldn't self-report whether it had proper data compliance standards. You would actually have an ongoing external validator of some form. Would it still make sense, though, that I feel like you're still ultimately going to have to annotate or label objects with the types of data that they are known to manipulate.
Yeah.
Like I know this pod is my user database pod or deployment or stateful set or whatever. This Cassandra stateful set has user information in it. It's personally identifiable information that's relevant to GDPR. I think you're still going to have some way of annotating and labeling these objects as indicating that they do manipulate that type of data. And then I think what we're saying is that we would have some additional external client that would go through and run an analysis of the entire cluster to try to figure out whether we have violations in progress.
Yep. And if you wanted something that was continuously running and reporting, you could run the client in a loop in a pod in the cluster, for example. That's the joy of Kubernetes extensibility.
Build another
Fair
operator.
Enough. Although that's the thing, I feel like an operator, or I mean, if you think about, I'll pick on Tiller for a second because I feel like Tiller is not necessarily that different. Tiller offers the client a touch point that they can go and say, hey, I want to deploy these additional things. But Tiller is also a pod within the cluster that is a client, it's heavily exploiting the fact that it can be a client of the Kubernetes API as well as a pod or a service running in Kubernetes. I feel like this notion of the compliance auditor could itself be a pod that its design is to always run as a Kubernetes pod, right, as opposed to kind of just a client-side tool. And it's basically going through and it is the enforcer, it is the informer on whether or not the policy that was defined, the data control policy that was defined, is being satisfied. And in that model, it's strictly an informer, right? So under that implementation model, to your point, it wouldn't tie into the admission controller. It would not be an active gate. It would allow you to do things you may not have done, like deploy mount a persistent volume with personally identifiable information into a development namespace, that might be considered a violation. So it can inform on the fact that this happened without necessarily preventing it from happening.
I'm sorry, but I need to run. But feel
Yeah.
free to point audit questions my way.
Sure.
Okay.
So just quick summary agreement. I think the three scenarios are really well discussed at this level. So I'm gonna incorporate those into the design document. But Michael, please, if possible, next week maybe talk with SIG Storage and SIG-Auth on this. I think the data controller is very interesting. Whether we implement outside Kubernetes on the client side or inside Kubernetes, it's a very interesting topic. Okay, but
sure,
for
I can do that.
Yeah, for the bulk of the description, I'm gonna incorporate it into the main document. English.
Okay. Erica, I'll reach out to see timing-wise, going and discussing it with the SIGs. I would assume you'd want to join as well.
I'm usually in SIG-Auth.
Okay, perfect.
So that's, yeah, SIG storage is one that I really haven't thought much about until we started discussing this.
Surprise, surprise.
Well, you know, everyone, right? Software, it's always changing, but storage, it's persistent. Wah,
Yes.
wah, wah. Sorry, storage-related humor.
Yeah. So I think
if you need to
timing...
archive that joke for later, you can. No? All right.
Okay. So I think that the timing of the scheduling policy is, I think, pretty good, since we are going to April, and after the scenarios, we are actually going into the I think after gaps, and that would be the architecture. So I think instead of continuing the documentation, I think we should just grab the chance and directly discussion on the scheduling policy. Would that be okay? Let's just follow up with this concrete example. So as a starting point, we discussed with SIG-Auth and SIG architecture, how everything should work. Sounds good?
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
I'm off tomorrow, so Monday, first thing, we'll be talking with scheduling.
Yep. Okay, great. So please don't forget to send out the meeting invite for the...
Yeah, I'll do that right now.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think that's it. Thank you so much. I don't have any other topics I want to cover for today's meeting. Okay. So
that sounds great. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. See
you guys. I'll capture the recording and get it pushed to YouTube.
Sure. See you guys next Monday.